Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Now, I always want to know why a speaker has chosen to devote their time to a subject. So, here is why I decided to look at what the people of Sheffield, my home city, did during the Great War. Now, a Facebook post set me on this interesting investigation because somebody mentioned a Brodie helmet, the steel helmet worn by the British soldiers in the Great War, which had been made in Sheffield. Now, I'd always looked at the front line during my research on the Great War, particularly while writing this here, my 10-part campaign series covering the Western Front, but I'd always focused on the battles and tactics. I'd never considered how the weapons of war had been made. Now, they all had one thing in common. They all contain steel parts. That Facebook post mentioned Dixon's of Sheffield, which was right on my doorstep. You see, James Dixon's factory had made silver-plated tableware for hotels and cruise liners before the war at his Cornish Place factory near the Kelham Island Industrial Museum. Now, the area is also well known for its real ale pubs if you're in the city. Dixon lived close to where I do, in Hillsborough, and his house is now my local library. Its garden is also my local park. Now, the website, Grace's Guide, is dedicated to Britain's industrial history. But the part that caught my attention was the list of businesses operating in 1918. It gave company details on what they made both before and during the war. Now, it seems all great war books published nowadays cover forgotten or overlooked subjects. However, I gave up buying books on Sheffield's war effort after the fifth one. I came across no less than 8 published on this subject in just the past few years. They were all pretty similar in content, and I found that they skimmed over many interesting details when I started looking into the subject. It's because they were written by authors who were devoted to local history, rather than the workings of the War Office, the Ministry of Munitions, or the Armed Forces. But first, I need to go back to the start of Sheffield's industrial past, sometime in the 1700s, to see how the city was in a prime position to help the armed forces in the Great War. But please bear with me, because I will move very quickly up to 1914. So the city had the 5 ingredients necessary for making steel products. It had iron ore, the raw material, which is smelted into pig iron. It had ganister, a heat-resistant sandstone used to line the furnaces. It had limestone, which turns the silicates into slag when the iron ore is heated up. It also had coal to heat up the furnaces, but here there had been a problem, because Charles Howard, the 11th Duke of Norfolk, he refused to let Sheffield have a canal to stop cheap coal being brought from Rotherham, which would cut his profits. So the factory owners of Sheffield responded by making small, high-quality items instead. That gave them a higher price per ton of steel. Howard's stubbornness had made the city famous throughout the world for 2 things: cutlery and knives. The town also had free power from its 5 rivers, which turned the many water wheels. And then Bernard Howard, the 12th Duke of Norfolk, he allowed a canal to open in 1819, while railways followed 20 years later. The city's factories were at last able to make and sell large steel items, just as the Industrial Revolution took off and steam engines replaced the water wheels. Now, Sheffield became a powerhouse for Great Britain, Europe, and the world. Its companies became famous everywhere. Sheffield was known as Australian sheep shearers and American gold miners alike. The Foundries started using iron ore from Sweden, but a safer source was soon needed following the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. The reason was that German control of the Baltic coast threatened the Swedish route. Now, a new source was found in Spain and investments were made in the Bilbao area. It allowed iron ore imports to rise from 200,000 tonnes in 1870 to a massive 7.5 million tonnes by 1913. And by chance, the Spanish source would be much safer from German U-boats when the war started. But back to Sheffield, where 5 scientists changed the way that warfare would be fought. Henry Sorby studied the surface of steel with a microscope in the 1860s, discovering the precise amount of carbon needed to create the strongest steel. Henry Bessemer, well, he then mass-produced steel with his new converter. Tools were wearing out quickly until Professor Arnold discovered how to make toughened steel. He added vanadium, which made the steel hard wearing, and it was called high-speed steel. It meant that precision weapons could be made in large numbers. Steel was also prone to go rusty, making it hard to keep clean. Harry Brearley added chromium to steel, creating what he called rustless steel. The name was soon changed to something we all know, stainless steel. That made weapons far easier to maintain. Sir Robert Hatfield discovered adding manganese, hardened steel to penetration, and this so-called Hatfield steel would soon be used for making helmets and tanks. So the combination of inventions made by these Sheffield scientists meant that large numbers of precision, hard-wearing, rust-free weapons could be made. Now, in this age of recycling, I want to note that the steel industry has been at it for well over 100 years. You see, all the offcuts and scrap were expensive to throw away, so they were taken back to the foundries to be reused. The original method was called the open hearth process. You get scrap steel and pig iron, you keep adding it to the furnace until it melts down and can be reused. But a new method called the electric arc furnace was in use by 1914. You simply pile scrap into a huge bin, drop the electrodes in, and bang, a huge jolt of electricity turned the pile into molten steel in a short but explosive time. So, Sheffield was well placed to serve Britain's war effort in 1914. The foundries were busy making steel castings, which usually came as bars or sheets of steel in different sizes. They were pouring molten steel from the furnaces into molds, and they could make everything from the largest item down to the smallest. Excuse me. Now, the factories were making these high-speed tools that I mentioned earlier. And the annual quantity produced in Sheffield would increase from 5 tonnes to over 300 tonnes during the course of the war, because Sheffield was shipping tools all around the country. So, factories were shaping the bars and sheets of steel, and it was said that half of the city factories were making steel plates to protect weapons of war, while the other half were making shells to knock holes in them. But we have to remember that the vast quantity of steel being made in the city was being used for shipping. The Army's annual order to Vickers, for example, before the war was just £35,000 a year. The Admiralty was placing a massive £3 million of orders a year. And names like Camel Laird and Vickers were well known when it came to warships. And Tom Vickers even boasted that his company could make everything needed to build a battleship. However, the Chamber of Commerce issued a warning early in 1913. Britain's factories simply could not keep up with orders despite delivering a record output that year. The city was as eager to help the war effort when Britain went to war on the 4th of August 1914. It had its territorial battalion, the 4th York and Lancaster Regiment, known as the Hallanders. And here we've got the police escorting them through the crowds down to a Midland train station. But like the rest of the country, there was also a wave of anti-German feeling across the city. The main example was that of Seaborn and Dichstall Steel Factory. The owners changed their name to something rather more English. They changed it to Arthur Balfour's. There was also a new army battalion, the Sheffield City Battalion, sometimes known as the PALs. However, a large part of the city's workforce are gone to the steel foundries and workshops. Now, that accounts for why there was only one PALs battalion from Sheffield when there were many others from other cities across the country. Now, I don't have the details, but many steelworkers did join the armed forces. For example, the Camel Laird Memorial lists over 800 men who joined up out of a workforce of around 6,650 men. You see, the problem was the success of Lord Kitchener's "Your Country Needs You" call to arms had caused a serious shortage of labour because the steel industry had lost a lot of men when it needed more. And no less than 36,000 men who were working in the metal trades at the beginning of the war across Yorkshire joined up. Now, they would be stuck in makeshift barracks over the winter with no weapons nor ammunition to practice with. And with hindsight, it would have been better to have them making the weapons and ammunition. Now, I can only give you a bit of a glimpse into Sheffield's contribution to the war effort because it was huge. 15,000 people were employed in the steel industry before the war. The big 5 companies, which were Vickers, Camel Laird, John Brown's, Firths and Hatfields, they would eventually employ 25,000 people between them by 1918. But there was another 200 smaller companies which switched from domestic to military production, and they would employ another 75,000 people across the city by the end of the war. Now, many of them worked in the area I've marked here on the map, between the city centre, bottom left, and where the M1 now passes Sheffield at Meadowhall, top right. Now, I remember this area as a child being like Dante's Inferno. You could see little of the sky by day due to the smoke and steam, but you could see glimpses of molten metal inside the huge melting shops at night. And you could always hear the hammers and other machinery working around the clock. So 100,000 people were employed in making steel items for the war effort in just one city. And given that scale of the effort, can I remind you that by 1918, a British infantry division was sometimes only 900,000 men strong. Now, there were many other workers involved in the huge logistics exercise required to support the industry. Horses and even the occasional elephant were put to work. They'd have to unload the raw materials at the foundries, move the castings to the factories, pick up the scrap, and then take the finished parts to the waiting trains. By the way, I've come across 2 elephants that were employed, one called Lizzie, we can see here, and one called Sarah. I've also come across a couple of anonymous camels in my look through the picture archives, and I can recommend the website Picture Sheffield if you want to know or want to see any more images of the city's past. Now, I should come on to the supporting services, which you need a lot of other people to support the steelworkers, such as those working on public transport that got them to work, those with emergency services when there was problems, and those who provided food and such as washing as well. Now, these chaps might remind me of Trumpton Fire Brigade, but they still had an important part to play if there was a fire around one of the factories. Now, 2 of my own ancestors got involved in the ancillary services. One was a police officer keeping law and order, and the other one was a knocker-upper. He tapped at windows with a long stick to make sure the workers got out of bed in time for their shift. So, the steel industry faced many problems before it could meet the armed services demands. Because there'd been industrial unrest before the war, as management and unions wrestled over regulations, working conditions and wages. The Board of Trade met the unions over the winter of 1914-15, and they set new overtime schemes, pay incentives, and subsistence payments. They agreed companies could employ skilled men and non-union labour, while workers were allowed to be moved between machines during shifts. They also discussed how to avoid strikes and lockouts, but the massive increase in the workforce required increased supervision, and there were never enough experienced foremen to go round. Machines were soon working around the clock, and a shortage of mechanics made them difficult to maintain. Managers didn't really understand the implications of pushing the workforce and the machinery so hard, and it would lead to quality problems and a large number of reject items. Now, the country was initially divided into two types of districts. Area A districts had ongoing War Office contracts, such as Sheffield steel industry, while Area B districts had no War Office contracts to work around. Now, this caused problems because labour had to be moved to where it was needed. Inevitably, this led to companies squabbling over the workforce as they switched production from domestic to military items. So the country was split into 10 regional areas in June 1915. Committees could then deal with the factory owners on a face-to-face basis. Sheffield would later become part of Area 3. The Yorkshire branch was based in Leeds. And instruction booklets like these were produced many times over, but would do little to alleviate the problem. Now, the government had already invited the larger companies to increase existing production, and many small firms were already subcontracted to the big five across Sheffield, and that left the War Office reluctant to start new contracts in the city. But everybody was eager to get involved in the war effort. The Armaments Output Committee decided it was time to get them involved because there was trouble brewing, because the BEF had insufficient shells at the front, particularly during the battles of Aubers Ridge and Festubert in May 1915. Now, that resulted in the creation of the Ministry of Munitions with David Lloyd George at its head. As you can see here, he's delivering his media showing that he's going to deliver the goods. Now, in Sheffield, the Munitions Committee was set up. As early as March 1915, a selection of items such as fuses and shells had been exhibited in the Sheffield Labour Exchange, and a workshop had been opened at the university to demonstrate how they could be made. Companies were invited along and asked if they could switch production. And once the company had decided to get involved, it would need to upgrade its machinery, expand its workforce, and train everyone to make the new items. The university also offered courses to train new employees on their lathes. Now, Colonel Herbert Hughes, who was on the previous slide, he established the Sheffield Munitions Committee in June 1915, and its main job was to distribute and coordinate the work across the city. He also had to negotiate the amount of labour each company needed to meet the orders. But one of its first tasks was to ask the War Department, could it please send 2,000 skilled men back from the front so that they could boost production. It then had to decide which jobs across the factories and foundries were reserved occupations, because the army was soon looking for more men for the front under the new recruitment scheme implemented by Lord Derby. So it had to issue exemption badges so that essential workers did not get hassled into joining up. Now, when Hughes died in 1917, Master Cutler Albert Hobson would take over the role at the head of the Munitions Committee. Now, Hughes and Hobson are both supported by Professor William Ripper of Sheffield University. He headed the University Science Advisory Committee, and that coordinated training, provided technical support and worked on research. So let's look at the process required to get an item from the factory to the front. And I'm going to use helmets as an example. The Army declared how many helmets it required. The Ministry of Munitions issued orders around the country based on known outputs. The local committee would source the raw material, which was sheet steel. One company was contracted to cut it into circles. A second company was engaged to mold the circles into helmets. Transport between the various factories also had to be sourced, and a company had to be organised to collect the scrap for recycling. Do you know how many helmets Sheffield made during the war? 975,000. The committee also had to discuss contract progress, financial items, and technical issues. And then there were the problems. For example, one company was investigated after it was suggested it was selling items to the Germans, and another was found to be faking or trying to pass off substandard products. But most of the discussions resolved around problems found by the factory inspector. For example, raw material, as in the steel, could have been poorly made, or the machining work was inaccurate. It was a complicated process, but it was trying to balance the Army's requirements against the nation's capacity to produce. And that required a balance of labour, machinery, and materials. Now, I'm just going to look at the Army. The War Office and the Ministry of Munitions faced three growing problems when considering the Army as the fighting unfolded on the Western Front and in other theatres as well. Firstly, it needed to supply units with all the usual weapons, such as rifles, artillery pieces, and shells. But we have to remember that the Army was increasing at a very rapid rate in a very short space of time. Now, the second issue was that the trench fighting, which nobody had expected, required extra guns, shells, and items such as barbed wire. It also required larger caliber artillery pieces, more machine guns, and lots of aeroplanes, which were a new weapon in the Great War, of course. And the third issue was the adoption of new inventions, new weapons, which added to the workload. Now, this included items such as helmets, grenades, mortars, Lewis guns, and of course, tanks. So, I'm sure that you all know that women became involved in industry in the Great War. The munitions industry would not have coped without them. Before the war, around 2,400 Sheffield women were employed. Most of them worked in the cutlery industry, working on buffing up the cutlery, and became known as the buffer girls. They wore these shapeless uniforms, while the polishing material they used made them grimy. Now, a lot more women were phased into the munition industry under three laws. In March 1915, the Shells and Fuses Agreement allowed ladies to work on unskilled tasks only. And we can just see that little advert at the top. Girls aged 16, wanted for war work, experience unnecessary. Apply James Dixon and Sons, Cornish Place. October 1915, the dilution scheme allowed ladies to be upgraded to semi-skilled workers. In September 1916, the general substitution scheme allowed them to do skilled tasks. So, during the course of the war, the number of women working in Sheffield's factories increased tenfold by 1918. That's 25,000 women have become involved in the war effort in just one city. Let's put that in perspective. There were 800,000 women employed across the country. So I'm now going to look at the different types of steel weapons that involve steel and where they were produced across Sheffield. We'll start with personal weapons. Roberts and Belk, McClory's, John Rounds, Walker and Hall's and Cutler's factories, they made swords, bayonets and knives. Matthias Spencer's and Hardy's, well, they made tools such as picks and shovels, like the engineers and the labourers used. Brown Bailey's, well, they made rifle barrels. Effingham's made cartridge clips. Kent Smith's made bullets. And this wonderful, deadly knuckle duster dagger for train traders, well, that was made by Ibbetson's. Then we've got steel helmets. John Brodie patented the steel helmet, and the original design was delivered to the front in September 1915. But the mild steel proved to be useless against shrapnel. So Hatfield's hardened steel, which I mentioned earlier, that was used instead. 5 million would be produced by the end of the war. Edgar Allen's, Tinsley Rolling Mills, Samuel Osborne's and Meadows rolled the steel. A company called Valolo's cut the circles. Then Viner's, John Rounds, Dixon's and Harrison's and Howson's, they then shaped the steel circles into helmets. Now, grenades at the start of the trench warfare were made in workshops or in the trenches, homemade affairs to begin with, and they were dangerous. The Mills No. 5 grenade was finally settled on. Now, across Sheffield, Brightsides, Paramore's, Henry Russell's, Pickford's and Trowns, they all switched to making grenades. Wilfred Stokes had designed a 3-inch mortar, and 1,600, around that number, were used on the Western Front. William Green's and Morwood's, they made mortar bombs. Meanwhile, Mappin and Webb's, they made white phosphorus bombs. And Dixon's made containers for the Livens projectors, little tubs which fired burning oil. Now, machine guns. The Vickers machine gun is a Sheffield weapon. It's been adopted in 1912, and the Vickers factory would end up employing nearly 10,000 men and 2,000 women, making it one of the iconic weapons of the Great War. Now, if you're wondering about the Lewis gun, they were made by the Birmingham Small Arms Company. Artillery pieces, they're complicated bits. You need several types of steel if you're going to make an artillery piece. Craven's made the gun carriages. Steel, Peach, Tozer and Bessemer's, they cast the barrels, while Brightsides bored them out. Hills and Tempered Steel made the breeches, while Ibbetson's, Woodhouse's and Bessemer's made the recoil springs. And finally, Hills and Woodhouse's made the recuperators, which reset the barrel after firing. Now, we know that the Great War was the first aerial war, and the number of aeroplanes increased dramatically. Well, a dozen Sheffield companies made plane parts. Ambrose Shardlow and Brown Bailey's, they made crankshafts. Laycock's and Mining Engineering made engine parts, while Craven's made the propellers. Samuel Osborne's made the bombs, while John Rounds, well, they made the armoured chairs which the crew sat in. Toledo Steelworks and Samuel Fox's, they made the wire which went between the wings. And of course, the tank. The first order for tanks, the 150 of them, was submitted in February 1916. Some would be assembled by William Foster's in Lincoln, and the rest by the Metropolitan Carriage Wagon and Finance Company of Birmingham. However, many of the parts are being cast and shaped in Sheffield. You see, Crowley's made the rigid cast iron frames. Spear and Jackson, Burry's, Tinsley Mills, Craven's, Samuel Osborne's, Mining Engineering and Edgar Allen's, they all made the panels, the bulletproof panels made from Hatfield steel. It's made the carcass of the tank. Edgar Allen's and William Green's, they made the hard-wearing links which were required for the tank tracks. Culver's and Henry Russell's, they made some of the intricate parts which went inside the tank. Altogether, nearly 3,000 tanks, whippets, gun carriers and supply tanks being made by the end of the war, and many of the parts have been cast, shaped, cut and drilled in Sheffield. The simplex works had also been busy making armoured cars for the Belgian and Russian armies. And then we come to shells. Now, ask anybody interested in the Great War about shells, they'll probably tell you three things. There was a scandal of not having enough in 1915. There were too many duds in 1916. But there was an awful lot of them in the war on the whole. One source I've seen said there was 160 million fired by the British Army, but I've got no idea how they counted them all. But I do realise that 1.5 million were fired in the few days before 1st of July 1916 alone. 1916. So let's have a look at the shell. It's a complex problem. This is a shrapnel shell cut in half. It's a precise piece made up of many parts. The charge sent the shell out of the gun at nearly 500 meters or 1600 feet per second. It can travel up to 6,000 meters or 6,500 yards. The time nose fuse on the right-hand side there could be set in increments of 1/6 of a second. Each click on that turn giving an extra 50 yards range, you hoped, as required for the creeping barrages which protected the advancing infantry during an attack. That would then set off a second charge in the base on the left-hand side called the game. That scattered the shrapnel balls like a shotgun. But one tiny manufacturing mistake and the shell was either useless or dangerous. Then we have the high explosive shell. Please don't try and read this, I know it's too small, but it's just to show how complicated it is. With the 25 stages required to make a high explosive shell. You think that's complicated? The instructions for the shrapnel shell far more complex. So what you got here from left to right are the tasks, the machine, the tool, the feed speed. That's how fast you push the piece into the machine, and the turning speed, how fast the lathe is turning. It's a complex operation, getting the maximum efficiency out of the workforce and machines, and that's listed on the right-hand side. Bringing that all together took some organization. Now, it's impossible to tease out the figures involved in casting the bars and tubes that were required to make shells. But 1,200 men and women at William Cook's were producing 250 tons of the raw material required to make shells every week. First would eventually open the National Projectile Factory at Templeborough. That's next to the M1, just opposite Meadowhall shopping centre. That opened in January 1916. Now 5,000 women would be employed cutting and trimming thousands of shells a day in those factory buildings. It was followed by a second factory at the East Heckler Works a few weeks later, and that's on the site of Meadowhall shopping centre itself. Once the tubes were ready to go, they were sent off by train to one of the national shell filling factories, the likes of Chilwell, Nottinghamshire, which I'm sure that you'll know is where 380 workers were killed or injured when the explosives detonated there by accident on the 1st of July 1918. Now, the women of Templeborough, they formed a thriving community. This is an extract from their newsletter, The Bombshell. It offered advice and support to the ladies and also a twist of humour, as you can see there on the right. But the women would find they were not welcome if they tried to get back into domestic work. You see, factory girls had acquired a reputation, probably unfairly, through the media, for example, for drinking, smoking and swearing, all because they got their hands dirty at work and they mixed with men. So everybody was working hard by the autumn of 1915. In fact, they were working too hard, and that was the problem. Companies were under pressure to meet targets, workers were getting fatigued, and machines were wearing out. Now, everybody was making good money, And they also thought that working hard was patriotic because they were supporting their husbands and boyfriends at the front. But working too fast when tired was causing production problems. And Sir George Newman set up the Health and Munition Workers Committee in September 1915. Its members carried out a review which related working conditions to productivity. It reported that workers were found to be pale, anemic, dull, and expressionless. Accidents had tripled on day shifts and by as much as fivefold on night shifts. Another chart for you. Again, don't try and read it. Newman's committee reduced working hours to, wait for it, 65 hours a week. Night work was cut back because it was found to be inefficient and dangerous. The committee also introduced many aspects of health and safety that we all recognise today. So these are the contents of the committee report. It looked at breaks, holidays and welfare arrangements and made sure they were improved. Sickness records, industrial diseases and dangerous substances had to be investigated. Machine design, clothing and ergonomics were considered to reduce repetitive strain injuries and other posture-related problems. They also looked at lighting and ventilation in the factories, and they studied supervision techniques and timekeeping. The committee went on to produce safety leaflets and information posters. Medicals and first aid training were introduced, while the causes, the prevention and the reporting of accidents and injuries were regulated. Now, it was all for the good of the workforce, but the studies had taken time to carry out and they'd take even more time to implement. But overall, there will be an improvement in working conditions and an improvement in quality. And now, the hangover cure. You see, Professor Albert Kent had also reported on what had become known as the Mundy effect. People were working too hard, but they were also playing too hard because they had a lot of spare cash in their pockets. And as we can see on the left here, Lord George announced that drink was a greater enemy than Germany or Austria. So what did they do? They reduced pub hours. We've seen that again, haven't we? They watered down beer. Well, prominent figures like King George V may have declared an alcohol ban in the royal household, but the news did not go down well for those who were working long hours in the hot conditions in the foundries and the factories. They also banned the buying of rounds of drinks. Now, I can still think of a few of my friends that still think that that law is in place today. But the committee's recommendations were soon working. Workers were turning out items at a much faster rate. And as I said earlier, they're also a much better quality as well. However, it will be too late for the start of the summer offensive, because as I'm sure you know, one of the big problems at the start of the summer offensive was shells. Now, the Munitions Committee was anxious that not an hour of work in the factories was lost. So they had people like this, munitions police. They also had a tribunal set up to deal with issues from both sides. Employees could complain about working conditions, hours of work, wages and safety. Employers complained about drinking, laziness, unauthorized leave and fraternizing between the sexes. Cases were then reported in the newspaper and there was a name and shame exercise as well as fines. So where did everybody live? Well, there was not always room to house everybody close enough to their place of work. So over 700 wooden huts were built around the Sheffield steelworks. They included hostels for single men and apartments for families. They soon became communities that were served by shops and entrepreneurs. However, landlords soon realized that tenants were earning a lot of money. Those who were working in the factories were earning a lot of money. And the Ministry of Munitions had to step in to stop raising workers' rents. And this was followed up by the Billeting of Civilians Act in September 1917. Now, I said that families lived in those wooden huts. Well, 3,000 of them were refugees who'd escaped from Belgium on the outbreak of war. They'd arrived in Sheffield in the autumn of 1915. A reception centre had been set up to welcome them, while the locals donated food and clothes. Many of them, as I said, ended up living in these temporary houses, those wooden huts, and they were employed in and around the factories. Continuing with those huts, they would eventually be turned into homes fit for heroes and lived in for another 20 years after the war. However, housing around factories such as those in Sheffield had led politicians to look at two things in post-war housing. Firstly, the large-scale medicals which are being carried out when tens of thousands of men had signed up at the beginning of the war and made something obvious. The country was in a poor state of health, and a lot of it was down to the state of poor housing. This was detailed in the Tudor-Walters Committee report in 1917. But the second thing was that there was a need for housing near munitions factories during the war. And this inspired Dr. Christopher Addison's Housing and Town Planning Act of 1919. This would result in permanent social housing being built near industries after the war. Let's think about it. Over 1 million social housing units will be built over the next 20 years. Thousands will be built by the Sheffield company, Henry Boot. In fact, it would build more than any other company. The only problem was Charles Boot advocated private housing because he thought you could get better quality for less money than what the local authorities were charging. Now, look at two scandals that were unique to Sheffield. On the left, we have the Dragonfly engine. The Simplex Motorworks was making the experimental Wasp aircraft engine when it became involved in an aeroplane engine scandal in 1918. You see, ABC Motors Limited had produced a new radial engine with a rotating crankshaft. It replaced the old rotary design, which had a stationary crankshaft. Now, Simplex had been involved in the development of the Dragonfly engine, and the Royal Air Force liked it so much it had ordered 11,000 units. Now, production was well underway when aerial testing proved it suffered from overheating and vibration. It meant that the Royal Air Force faced a serious engine shortage in the middle of 1918. Fortunately, the war ended before it became too serious a problem, and the government was able to cancel production as the war came to an end. Now, the second scandal involves the chap on the right. That's Jonah Jonas. He came from Germany in the 1860s, and he'd established the Continental Steel Works. He'd been very successful, and he'd even been the Lord Mayor of Sheffield in 1904. However, he was charged with conspiring to contravene the Official Secrets Act in 1918 for discussing things he should not have been discussing with a German customer. He'd been talking about a new rifle and a naval steering gear, which Vickers were in the process of developing. Now, felony charges were dropped because the discussions had taken place before the war, but Jonas was still fined. Probably his greatest loss was the loss of his knighthood and his citizenship. Now, another thing unique to Sheffield, if you think of, if I asked anybody from the city about the Sheffield Blitz, they would probably think of the devastation caused by the Luftwaffe in December 1940 when it tried to knock out the factories, steel factories in the Second World War. However, during the early hours of 26th of September 1916, Zeppelin L-22 flew over the city. One witness reported, "Suddenly we heard a droning, terrifying sound overhead, which became stronger every minute. The Zeppelin dropped 36 bombs, and they hit mainly houses around Pittsmore and Burngreave in that Dante's Inferno area. 28 people were killed and 150 buildings were damaged. And here we can see on the left that the first thing that the insurance companies did was offer you housing insurance against Zeppelin raids. And on the right, we have the memorial to those who lost their lives. Now, reports of the raid only stated that a North Midland town had been damaged by a bombing raid, and full details of what had happened would be withheld until after the war. So when this bloody war is over, the armistice came and went, and the report that in the newspaper that sticks in my mind is where a reporter asked one woman what she thought about it. She said, "I'm glad it's all over. I'm glad we won, but I wish my son was still here to see it." Because the women were laid off. They went back home, often widowed or more lost sweetheart or son. Some would never marry again. Some will be left with husbands who are either mentally or physically impaired. This is the memorial at Sayre on the left, where many of the Sheffield pals lost their lives on the 1st of July 1916. And on the right is the memorial, which was in Dixon factory, the factory which started me off on this talk. Now, many of those women struggled to feed their children off the meagre pensions offered. They'd done their bit and they had the certificates to prove it. And that was all. And the memories, of course. On the left is a certificate of thanks from the King, and on the right is a certificate of thanks from a factory, in this case, the National Projectile Factory at Templeborough. The people of Sheffield had made 11.6 million items for the war effort, as we can see at the top, at a cost to the country of 1.5 million back then, or apparently nearly 50 million in today's prices. Now, over 8 million women were given the opportunity to vote for the first time in November 1918. However, they would have to be 30 years old and either married or earning a wage. Men only had to be 21 years old. So I reckon that excluded many of the young ladies who'd worked hard for the past 4 years in the factories. The other 5 million women would have to wait until their circumstances changed, or wait another 10 years before they got the vote. So, industry now faced an uncertain future. The Great War was a watershed in the relations between industry and the state. The Ministry of Munitions had become involved in the planning, financing, and directing of manufacture. Companies had made huge profits. For example, Samuel Fox's profits had risen 7-fold in 4 years. But companies were worried about their future in peacetime. Some even went as far as merging with their rivals to protect business, while they were all calling for preferences and tariffs across the empire, because they wanted to protect their business from the German cartels. Instead, as we can see on the right, all they got was the Safeguarding of Industries Act of 1921. It only promised limited protection for a list of essential items. The war had forced companies to take on military contracts, and now they had to return to their domestic products. And a lot of their profits were needed to pay the liabilities associated with scaling down their businesses. The government had simply walked away, leaving them with large bills under the new excess profit tax. It would mean that companies would be wary of getting involved in future nationalisations, such as that brought in by the Railways Act of 1921. Now, like everywhere else, Sheffield's industry soon found itself in a post-war depression. Over time, an incentive disappeared, while the labour market became an employer's market. The factories were reducing in size as men were returning from the armed forces, and unemployment across the city quickly rose to above 15%. Poverty was on the increase and gang warfare broke out across the city. The press would even refer to it as Little Chicago. The city of Sheffield had gone from economic highs to lows in just a few years. So there you have the story of the men and women of steel. I've chosen to stick to Sheffield because it is where I've grown up and it's where I'm back now after many years away. That means that I've been able to connect with the stories I saw in the newspaper archives. Please take your time to look at what went on in your own town or city during the war. You'll be surprised at what you find, because factories expanded and opened across the country. I must recommend the online British newspaper archive, because the media stories from the 1914-18 period give a unique insight into how the conflict was viewed on a day-to-day basis by those who were living the experience. But I also hope that by studying my city, I've been able to drill down into the detail of the home front. So that's the end of my talk, and I would like to say thank you to you all for listening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. Thoroughly enjoyed that. So in the best traditions of what we do after these talks, if you've enjoyed that, please a round of applause via the raising hand button, which you'll find in the bottom of the screen. And Andrew, I can confirm that the number of hands going up electronically is fantastic. So please take that as a round of applause from everybody concerned. So if people want to lower their hands, that's fine. You don't need to keep your hands raised there, and ask Andrew questions. We'll have a relatively brief Q&A session now, I think. I know I've got a couple of questions in already, so if you'd like to type in your question on the Q&A button underneath, that'd be tremendous. Okay, Brian Jones.
Yeah, hello. I don't know if you've got me, but the impression was from your talk that you were going to talk about the Brodie helmet, and I was led to believe that the manufacture of the Brodie helmet was limited to like a flat top helmet because we hadn't got the technology to press steel, unlike the German helmet, which was pressed and afforded a better protection to the soldier. Have you got any comments you can make on that one?
Well, as I said, what started me off on this talk, or on the looking into it, was Dixon's factory. Dixon, before the war, his factory had been making teapots, which is by the name of the talk, teapots to tin hats, because when you look at the teapots he was making, they are like pressed items into round teapots and dishes and bowls. So it's a similar sort of process. It's just a different type of material, which is why they would need extra training and extra types of machinery. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for your question there, Malcolm. You're unmuted there, Malcolm Sperrington. Do you want to go ahead with your question there?
Yes, thank you, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I can, yeah.
That's good. Interesting to learn that you're a football fan, David. I must talk to you about that sometime. But anyway, Andrew, that was a most interesting talk.
Thank you.
Very often, what goes on behind the scenes, one never thinks about. And to learn the input of not only Sheffield, but the other towns such as Birmingham and Lincoln with the tanks and things like that, it's absolutely intriguing. My question is, again, about the Brodie helmet, and something that's intrigued me for a long time. I understand when they were first produced in 1915/16 and supplied, they were rimless, and that at a later date a rim was added. For instance, there's mine, and you can see the rim on it, Right. Maps.
Yeah,
and I'm just wondering what reason that was done.
I can only speculate that. Well, with what you started off with there, I looked at Sheffield because it's where I live, it's where I know. I can visit places, I can visualize things, and I've also I've got access to the like the library archives and the Sheffield archive. So it meant that I decided to look at one city rather than the whole front, which allowed me to drill down into more of the detail. And I'm hoping that people go away and think, oh, I wonder what did my town or city do? The two biggest ones that I would mention are like Newcastle and Glasgow, where they have the shipbuilding, for example. I know that I've only talked about the army. It's like all of these talks, you either spread out and try and cover everything, or you look deeper into something. As for the helmet, I don't really know unless, as time goes on with a lot of these things, if we think about the tank, for example, you start off with the Mark, you end up with like the Mark 5. They take it, they try it, they improve it, they go back, they come up with problems, they go back to the drawing board and they improve things. And then the factories are asked, can you do this? That's all I can think of, that they started off getting out something pretty quick. The original ones were like a mild steel, which found to be no good, so they used the Hatfield steel. So I'm assuming that they must have said, can we put a rim on it? Makes a better item, and the factories have been approached and they come up with a way of doing it. I don't know if that's, I don't know the exact reason, that's me just speculating.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for your question, Malcolm. We've got somebody, Mark, who's just contributed towards this on helmets, saying the A pattern helmet did not have a rim, the B pattern had a rim because it was stronger. So thanks for that, Mark, for that contribution to that particular question.
The B type was the Hatfield steel, which things would bounce off it rather than go through it. It's the same sort of steel that was used on the later tanks. Shrapnel and bullets would bounce off it, more likely bounce off it.
Bill, thanks for that, Andrew. Right, okay, next question, Natalie. You were next with your question there. Natalie, you're live and you're unmuted, so fire away with your question.
Yeah, hi Andrew, thank you for an interesting talk. You mentioned right at the beginning about some of the competition between Rotherham and Sheffield, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how that manifested itself during World War I and the steel production that was going on in the area.
I don't, because I've only looked at Sheffield. I just thought that the back with the coal, the reason why I mentioned that is that everybody knows Sheffield for cutlery, and the reason that Sheffield made cutlery was the local duke wouldn't let them have a canal, so they had to make small items. I don't know anything. I have not looked into. I know that Rotherham also had its own factories, but I've not looked. I am looking at the nation at the moment, but it's a massive subject. It's a bit like, imagine looking at one division on the Western Front and then looking at 60 divisions. You see what I mean? I basically looked at one city and there's like 60 towns and cities to look at. Yeah. But the interesting thing for me is that the more I've looked into it and the more I've asked around people is that not many people have looked at the home front, and without it, the war wouldn't have been fought. Without these things, the war wouldn't have happened in the way it did.
That's so true. It's the first talk we've had on the home front.
I've also tried to bring out the importance of what women did in industry. Without women making things, men wouldn't have had things to fight with.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Right. Next question on my list, Nigel Crompton.
Yeah, two major points, or 2 points. First is, could you confirm, Andrew, the number, you quoted Chilwell, the number of dead at Chilwell,
I said killed, I said killed and injured. I lumped the two numbers together. I think it was about 130 killed and the rest were injured. I put the two numbers into one.
Right, okay, that's fine. It came over in your talk that there were over 300
No,
killed.
sorry. I said killed and injured. It killed and injured.
I'm sorry, I'm a fire service historian, so
Yeah, sure.
we get anarchy about these sort of things. The second
That's all
thing is you on your slide you show the women police service as
Yeah.
munitions police.
As what, sorry?
They were as munitions police.
Yeah.
They were not purely just for munitions, though, were they? They were also used in barrack areas and areas where there were, let's say, the possibility of men and ladies getting together. So I think you're doing the women's police service a slight injustice in just, and I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Well, it's actually Sheffield Archives that are doing them an injustice because it was their picture.
Right. In that case, then you need to get it changed, mate.
Right. Well, my point there, the point of the illustration was to, I found it more of an interesting picture than a picture of a tribunal. I mean, the point I was getting across that there were tribunals in the, in the industries, and ladies like that, they would have done all sorts of things. My great grandfather was a police officer, so he would have been involved in tribunals as well when people didn't turn up for work. So it was more of an illustrative picture to sort of get the mood of that people were watching you while you were working to make sure you work.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Thanks for your question there, Nigel. Just one question. I'm not going to invite Pat to come on live here because it's just a very quick question. Andrew, one question's come up. Can you just detail again the website on the Sheffield history? That was a question that's come up.
Picture Sheffield. Okay, Picture Sheffield. It's a massive archive of photographs that the Sheffield Archives have put online that you can look at.
Super, thanks for that. Right,
the other websites I mentioned were Grace's Guide.
Okay.
Grace's Guide is a free website which details all sorts of aspects about industry across the country through the ages. And then the other one, which I'm sure a few of you know, I used for looking at Sheffield particular stories, and that was British Newspaper Archives.
Super, right.
But you have to pay for British Newspaper Archives.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Right. So next one, Anthony Davis, you're live. If you want to fire away with your question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. Really interesting talk that was. My question is was there a process of feedback from the front, on the performance of equipment, so that may affect the future manufacturing process? So improvements, in other words, could improvements be made to guns or shells or whatever the equipment was?
Well, I'll use one example. That's the tank. We started off with the Mark 1, September 1915. Lots of problems. So they had 2 and the 3 we used like as training tanks. The Mark 4 then comes in at Messines. So can you see that from the Somme, when they use the tank, they look at it, the problems, or it's breaking down, it needs more fuel, it needs better armour. So that's just one example. So I'm assuming, we can all assume that similar feedback comes from items. Is that helpful?
Yeah, whose responsibility was it then to feed that back to manufacturers, or just
I don't know.
The chain of command? No,
I don't know, because I'm sure that some people know better than me. I've been looking at the home front. So
yeah, okay, that's fine.
I'm just saying that if you think of the tank, we all know pretty much the development of the tank between September 1915 through to November 1918. There's a lot of development, so it's quite obvious that people are talking between
the crews that are using them and the factories that are making them. There's a definite process there. So I'm pretty sure if they're doing it in the tank, you know, in the various stages of the tank or the various forms of it, it must be done with other arms.
Right. Okay.
Ancillary pieces, they were improved as well.
That's I think that's just about covers that one. So thanks very much indeed for that answer. Thanks for your question there, Anthony. Last question. We're going to wrap it up quite quickly now, I think, really.
Okay.
Which is just Gordon Holmes. Gordon, if you want to unmute yourself there.
No.
Right, we got that. Yeah, smashing. Andrew, fascinating. I enjoyed that enormously, especially from a town where I've worked a great deal in many of the steelworks as a lift engineer. So I've seen the inside and the inner working of these places. Fabulous.
I'm glad to hear that somebody has actually worked, and I haven't worked in a steel factory. I've just lived in the city where
I've worked in many steel factories in Scunthorpe, in Stockton on Tees, Middlesbrough, all over the country. My question to you is, Andrew, were the shells that were manufactured in Sheffield actually filled and armed there, or were they sent away for filling and arming? And also, were the brass fuses that were on the end, that were fitted to the ends, also made in Sheffield?
Right, first part of your question, if you think about the safety of it, when you're making a shell, there's lots of sparks around.
There are.
When you're filling it up, you don't want sparks around.
Absolutely, no, I agree. I mean, they had an occasion in Bradford where one blew up, where the filling shell.
Just off the M62, I know the location.
Right, yeah.
No, what they did was that it's a national projectile factory, which is where in Sheffield there was a national projectile factory, of which there were several. So they're actually making the casing.
Yes.
And then that's sent to a filling factory. So that's where there's a lot more safety involved with the explosive material.
Yeah.
Now all the little factories that would have normally been making cutlery, they turn their hands to making the shell parts. That's for things like the fuses. The explosive is called a gain, G-A-I-N-E. That's the little explosive cap that goes at the bottom of the shell, which makes it explode like a
projectile. Yeah.
And then you've got the tube between the two. So a lot of the small parts, the intricate parts, were made by companies that have been making, smart cutlery. Because
like Vine, one, I suppose, were one.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, during wartime, people don't need posh cutlery.
No, they don't. Do they?
That's why they switched, because people weren't buying their original, their cutlery and their knives and all their fancy gear, but they could still make a profit making parts for shells.
Yeah, making ancillary equipment for the shells. Yeah. Right, thank you very much for that, Mum. I enjoyed that enormously.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for your question there. So,
I say, David, it's good to hear that somebody who works in the industry has enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, I'm going to wrap it up there, Andrew. So, sincere thanks for your presentation. Really interesting to learn about the home front, which is an area that we don't really study enough, and it was extremely interesting, certainly focusing on Sheffield and obviously the massive industry that went into armament production there. Real eye-opener from my perspective, and I'm sure from everybody else's perspective. So once again, if you enjoyed that, just raise your hands as a round of applause, please. And Andrew can confirm that the hands are going up massively. So take that as the round of applause. And once again, sincere thanks. Everybody who's watching, there's going to be another webinar next Monday, but an hour earlier. We're starting at 7 p.m. because the chap who's giving the talk is actually in India. So their time zone is much further on than ours. So if we didn't drag it forward to 7 p.m., he'd be talking to us in the early hours of the morning. It's going to be bad enough for him as it is. So if everybody who wants to tune in to listen to the Indian Labour Corps next Monday, please remember it starts at 7 p.m, not 8 p.m. So Andrew, sincere thanks once again. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and please do keep on writing your books.
Okay, thanks.
Tremendous. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to everybody, and good evening. Good night.
Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentiers, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentiers, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentiers, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentiers, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentiers, parlez-vous.